Good morning. My name is John Lee and I'm a non-resident senior fellow and adjunct professor at the United States Studies Center and a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute in Washington. Welcome to this webinar on the role of United States innovation in securing Australia's economic future, the title of which will come from a report by Jared Mondschein, who's a senior advisor at the United States Studies Center. The report will be released next Thursday. Back in 2017, Jared released an enormously influential report entitled Indispensable Economic Partners, the US-Australia Investment Relationship. The upcoming report builds on this, but more of that later. Now, to set the scene, let me present two largely unquestioned pieces of common wisdom, which you'll hear if you spend any time in Australia. And I think Jared's work really takes on these two bits of common wisdom head on. The first is that the United States is our most important security partner, but China is our most important economic partner. Every poll of Australians have a majority believing that this is the uncontested reality. Second, there is a common wisdom that Australia should win the International Prize for Economic Management and Resilience. We are the miracle economy. Since 1991, we have had 28 years of consecutive economic growth, and it would have been a 29th year but for the COVID-19 pandemic. Australia weathered the dot-com bubble and the bubble bursting. We weathered the global financial crisis and a 2015 Chinese economic slowdown. Many believe we've conquered the so-called Dutch disease, that is, the heavy reliance on a small number of sectors, such as commodities and minerals, and that this notion would spell doom for the economy. Well, it doesn't seem to have done that. So what's not to like about the Australian economy? Well, I think there are some sober messages that we need to heed, and this provides some of the background for Jared's upcoming report, which speaks about the importance of innovation and how Australia is going on this account. It talks about the role of the United States in upscaling the Australian economy, and it talks about where we need to go from here. Now, we'll then have a discussion on these and other issues with a fantastic group of panelists. They are fantastic because they are drawn from quite a few different job descriptions, but all are at the top of their field. Now, to those who have registered, I am monitoring the questions and I will work them in to the extent that I can. So please keep sending them in if you have them. So let's get to the panel. Jared Mondschein is a senior advisor at the Centre, and he works across all three of the Centre's programs, that is foreign policy and defence, trade and investment, and innovation and entrepreneurship, and his report next Thursday cuts across all those three areas. His analysis has appeared in major outlets in US, in Europe, in Asia, and Australia. He was previously with Bloomberg in Washington, DC, and also the Council on Foreign Relations. James Caruso is known to all Australians in government and extremely highly regarded by all of us. If you ask anyone in Australia, from officials in departments to the Prime Minister, they will have nothing but praise for the work that Jim did while he was in Canberra. He has been at the forefront of economic diplomacy in the Asia Pacific for most of his career. Now the Managing Director of the Bao Group Asia Pacific in Singapore, he was the Senior Foreign Policy Advisor to the US Indo-Pacific Command in Hawaii, and before that, the Deputy Chief Mission and Chargé d'Affaires at the US Embassy in Canberra. Alex Lynch manages government affairs and public policy for Google in Australia, where he's responsible for helping Australia adapt to a digital world economy, which is no small task. Alex has a decade of experience in strategic reputation and crisis management, and prior to joining the private sector, worked for the New Zealand government on national security issues. And Dr. Sarah Pearson is the Innovation Lead and Deputy Director General, Innovation of the Department of State Development, Tourism and Innovation in Queensland, which means Sarah is in charge of policies to enhance Queensland innovation. Before that, she was Chief Scientist and Chief Information Officer at the Commonwealth Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, founding CEO of the CBR Innovation Network. She was at the University of Newcastle. She was CEO of ANU Enterprise. She was a management consultant with McKinsey and Company. And if that isn't enough, she was a tenured physics academic at the University of New England. Let me now invite Jared to introduce some key points and arguments from his report, and then we'll have a conversation with the panelists after Jared's introductory remarks. So Jared, could I please hand to you?
Thanks so much, John. And it's an honor to have such a distinguished panel here today. I really appreciate the time that they, as well as the attendees, took to be here today. So over the next few minutes, I'm just going to give you a preview of my report. This is the first time that I'm sharing these findings publicly. The keyword is preview. We're releasing this on Thursday, as John mentioned. And if you subscribe to the US Study Center on our website, ussc.edu.au, you'll be the first to get the full thing when it is released. As John mentioned, the genesis of my work on this is a report I came out with 3 years ago, actually yesterday. It's the Indispensable Economic Partners. As John mentioned, I was at Bloomberg in DC, and the CEO of the US Study Center, Simon Jackman, brought me out here to help with this report. And it was, I think, it went well. It was launched in Canberra with then Finance Minister Scott Morrison. I had Jim Caruso, who's then acting ambassador from the US to Australia. We had launch events in Sydney with Alex, who's also here today. We had launch events in Melbourne, Adelaide, Brisbane. It went really well. And I think it had a particularly good impact because it, as John said, sort of flew in the face of conventional wisdom about the US role in Australia. And that is today, and for some decades now, the US is the largest foreign investor in Australia and the largest destination of Australian investment overseas. But as impactful as that report was, I think as soon as I finished it, I wanted to do more, because the more I delved into the data, the more I saw that there needed to be more of a follow-up. There needed to be a bit of a better understanding of that story. So if I could just start with the slide deck, Maura. What I want to start with first is the story of the cumulative value. What you see here on this slide deck is how the US is, like I said 3 years ago, the largest investor into Australia. Cumulatively, US firms spend more, employ more, sell more, buy more, and contribute more to Australia's GDP than firms from in Australia than firms from any other country. You'll see here that the UK is second, but I think the chart makes clear that's not even a close second. Compared to the second place UK, there are twice as many US firms in Australia. There are twice as many employees of US firms in Australia. US firms own more than 3 times as much in assets. US firms spend more than 3 times as much on capital expenditures. And they add twice as much to the Australian economy, which you see in industry value add on the far right. And I think cumulatively, just like 3 years ago, this is a remarkable story. But what I want to show you today and in this report is that it's not just a cumulative story. I think that stories are already been told. And as much as I think there could be more messaging on that story, which I think we proved just last month when we found that 71% of Australians still think that China is the #1 investor into Australia, which is clearly not correct. I think what I want to do today is focus more on the quality, not just the cumulative and the quantity. And so if I could go to the next slide. What I want to do here is talk about that quality and why that quality is important. The exact future of the global economy is unknowable. We don't know exactly what it's going to be, but we do know a general idea of the direction where it's headed. Services are going to be more important. Value creation will be tied to knowledge-intensive and automated processes and skills, and firms and individuals will need flexibility and resilience. And I think the shorthand term for all of this is that you need to be more. Countries and companies and individuals will need to be more innovative. And these global shifts are, I think, most acutely visible in the digital transformation of everything from shopping to media consumption and the need for flexibility and resilience, but particularly amid strategic competition between the US and China. All of these shifts have been accelerated by the global pandemic. So here is that quality that I'm talking about. This slide here tells you how the average firm, an average employee, how they compare at a US firm versus an Australian firm versus a foreign firm that is not American. The average employee of the US firm in Australia contributes 3 times as much to Australia's GDP as the average employee of an Australian-owned firm, and 22% more than the average employee of a foreign-owned firm that is not US owned. And in terms of wages, you can see the significant discrepancy between a US firm versus an Australian firm, $20,000 or more, and $2,000 more per year than a non-US owned firm. And so what I think is beyond this is what I find interesting is the US investment is not just cumulative, it's also quality, as you can see here, but it's also in interesting sectors that are the most relevant to Australia's future economy. So I found that out of 19 sectors of Australia's economy, the US is the #1 investor in 14 of them. So 14 out of the 19 sectors, the US is the #1 foreign investor into Australia. And it is those specific sectors that I think are particularly interesting. So what are they? US-owned firms in manufacturing account for 40,500 Australian jobs. 40,500 Australian jobs, or about 5% of all workers in the entire industry across Australia. And that's 11% and they make up 11% of the entire industry's contribution to GDP. Then you have information, media, and telecommunications. That's another sector. That includes IBM, Google. These firms, US-owned firms in Australia in this sector account for 13,000 Australian jobs, or 10% of all workers in the entire industry across the country. And they also account for 6% of Australia's GDP. Then the third most notable sector that I want to talk about is professional, scientific, and technical services. That's everyone from Amgen, a pharmaceutical and biotech company, to Cook Medical Group, which develops medical technologies and innovations. US-owned firms in Australia account for 55,800 jobs in this sector, 6% of all workers in the entire industry across Australia. And they also account for 10% of the entire industry's contribution to GDP. In all 3 of these sectors, US firms are not only the largest investors, but no other country's investments are even half the size of the US investment footprint. So if I could go to the next slide, I'll talk about why is this relevant. I think this is a bit of a snapshot as to why. Now, we all hear about research and development. R&D is not the sole measure of innovation, but it certainly is a good one to start with. And the most innovative economies in the world, Israel, Germany, Korea, and the US, they all have higher R&D spending as a percentage of GDP than the US. And they also have all increased their R&D spending in recent years. Australia stands alone in seeing its R&D spending decrease in every year of the last decade. And other clear examples of how Australia is fallen in this area is that of the Global Innovation Index, Australia has fallen out of the top 20 in the last few years. In global rankings of economic complexity, a measure often correlated with future economic growth, Australia ranks 87th in the world, falling behind countries like Uzbekistan, Botswana, Guatemala. And then just recently, a think tank in the UK determined that Australia is the single most economically reliant country on China out of the Five Eyes group. That is the US, UK, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia. And this is definitely a challenge to economic resilience when Australia's top trading partner has increased its use of economic coercion. And I think this is but one slide showing that Australia is moving and has been moving in the wrong direction for some time and away from global trends. But however, the good news is that Australia's trade investment with the US has continued to push Australia in a more future-oriented area. And US firms, you see here, Australia has been decreasing. US firms in Australia have spent more than $1 billion on R&D in Australia since 2009. For context, the entire Australian government spent $10 billion just last year. And last year, the US firms spent 1.2 billion Australian dollars on R&D. If I could go to the next slide. So I've spoken and published about the Australian investment relationship with the US. But one thing I want to talk about is services. Services is the future global economy. As I said in the beginning, that is where the global economy is shifting. And today, US-Australian services trade is 27% greater then Australia's second largest services trading partner, China. And we hear in Australia about how key foreign students are, but from China in particular to Australia's GDP. And they are, but you can still see that the services two-way trade between the US and Australia is still larger than Australia. And this is, you can see or if you look at global trends, services is increasing at a faster rate than goods. So the trade of services is faster and increasing faster than the trade of goods. And Australia is actually going along global trends in this area, and their services trade has increased at 6.5% over the last 5 years, whereas goods trade has increased at 4.5% over the last 5 years. And to give you an idea of just how critical services is, they account for 70% of Australia's GDP today. Now, if I could go to the next slide. So the question is, how does Australia's services trade with the US compare to its trade with other countries, including China, as well as globally? I think these three pie charts are pretty clear. The US is a more diversified trading partner than China in services, and than where Australia is trading in general. US services trade with Australia has foreign students, it has tourism, as you see in the pink here, but it also has three other key areas, including intellectual property charges, the use of patents, trademarks, copyrights, has other business services, which is R&D services, professional and management consulting services, trade-related services. It also has telecommunications, computer, and information services. For more than 20 years, Australia's trade in these three key service areas has been larger from the US than anywhere else, with the US than anywhere else. And in 2018, Australia exported Australian exports of intellectual property to the US grew 11% from the prior year, totaling more than $400 million, and more than 5 times the size of the next largest destination, the UK. And it's similar with these other key sectors as well. Again, it is not just a cumulative story of being the top services partner. It is that quality story as well, where those trade and services are key to the nature of those trade and services is key to Australia's future economic well-being. So one thing that I should note is that the future orientation of these ties go beyond trade and investment. US-Australian collaboration in space predates the creation of NASA even, but it led to Australia hosting the largest number of NASA tracking stations outside of the US and enabling TV images of Neil Armstrong walking on the moon. It was through Australian being involved in NASA's mission to the moon that we could actually see the moon landing. And in 2019, more than half a century later, the Morrison government allocated recently $150 million to help Australian businesses get involved in the US mission to Mars. And Australia's well-known robotics and automation tech abilities in mining are expected to be integral to NASA's current goal of extracting resources in space. And even beyond space, you have extensive collaboration and ties in medical research. Australia is the United States' second largest international collaborator in cancer research, only trailing Canada. And this is resulting in collaboration on world-renowned projects like the Cancer Moonshot, which you may have heard about. And then just this week, the US and Australia convened the Joint Commission meeting on Science and Frontier Technologies dialogue, and they talked about everything from AI, quantum information science to ocean exploration, mapping. And this involved high-profile folks. It involved the Australian Minister for Industry, Science and Technology, Karen Andrews. It involved the Australian CSIRO. It also involved the White House Office Policy Director for the Office of Science and Technology, the US Chief Technology Officer, the National Science Foundation. This is top innovative leaders in the US and Australia. And these are industries that will determine the future. That's what I think is the main takeaway. And these dialogues between close friends and partners and the research and industry collaboration that will spin off of them, I think they offer Australia a bolstered role in the future economy and more complex. It's more complex than simple exports, more resilient than services like education and tourism. So with that, I'll throw it to John for a conversation with our excellent panel.
Thank you, Jared. I was struck by one of the statistics in particular in terms of value added. US firm, 71.5 billion, I think the figure was. Chinese firms 4.7 billion. Sarah, or perhaps Alex, maybe I can start with you. This bigger economic footprint by American firms in Australia, on any criteria you want, on a per employee basis, on a per firm basis, is that something you've observed in your dealings with the Australian economy? But probably a more important question is why? Why is it that US firms add so much more disproportionately than firms from other countries? So Sarah or Alex, happy for either one to chip in.
Shall I jump in and get started? And first of all, I'd like to say thanks for inviting me to be part of this. It's great to be having this conversation. I think now is absolutely the sweet spot time to be having it. You know, if you think about the global shifts you're talking about, Jared, there's a massive global shift going on right now, and I think that it's accelerating the need for innovation, but it's also accelerating the desire for it. So our population are having to innovate, they're having to change, they're seeing that science is needed to get them through this pandemic. So I think we're living in a really, really fantastic time from that perspective. On the downside, obviously, there's the R&D, which is going to have a very, very big shock hitting it financially. So we've got to make sure we take care of that, which brings us to the crux of, you know, collaborating with these American firms, but also America beyond just the firms. Really good to see the stat. I love that stat. Industry value added per firm, $35.12. You know, great, much greater than anything that we have for our own companies. And I think that says a lot. I think that's partly the sophistication of the American companies that are domiciled over here. They come here with sophisticated products and services. And I think what's exciting is that they see the strong benefit of the research that we have in Australia. Australia's research is globally renowned for being world-class across the board, but obviously there's some specific areas that it's very, very strong in. And I think that's what attracts these companies to Australia. I mean, there's other policy levers as well, but I think it's absolutely that excellence. And it's been good to see more and more of them coming over here and setting up R&D entities. So I think of Lockheed Martin and its Stella down in Melbourne, for instance, the Boeing research that happens up here in Queensland. It's really been great to see in the last few years a lot more moving into that collaborative partnership R&D space rather than just coming over here and trying to sell their services. So I think that's a really, really good move. You talked about the strong relationship around innovation. And I think the key there is that American companies are looking at, well, what will they collaborate on? You know, space and spatial massively growing. We've got some great expertise here in Australia, so seeing a lot more around that. You talked about AI, Jared. You know, obviously there's a lot of controversy around who's spending what money on AI, and it makes a big difference who is spending that money. So it's really good to see us having those conversations. So I think bringing your companies from the US coming over here and partnering with us on that is really, really key. I think what'll be interesting will be around data. So data is, I believe, the fastest growing commodity. So, you know, you talked about IP trading, which is good to see. I think that's partly a maturity in our university system, realizing that they can license offshore, so licensing to the US. So that's really fascinating. And from my perspective, that fits in with the data piece too. But I really want to see us doing a lot more around deep tech and that trading and collaborating on deep tech. So I'm on the investment committee of Main Sequence Ventures, very proud of what we do there, building deep tech industries in Australia. I'd love to see a lot more collaboration by the US and US companies on that deep tech here in Australia. And the research, I think we've been doing quite a lot of that. We will have to do more and more collaboration, not just from you're talking about the companies that are over here, John, but it'll be much broader than that because no one's going to have a lot of money for research. We're going to have to do a lot more collaborating. The SBIR has been a fantastic opportunity for Australia. I know a lot of companies have commercialized in the US because of the SBIR in the US, and that's obviously collaborating with US companies. But the MNCs here, I think they are becoming much more aware of opening up to ideas to take to market through their supply chains. And again, I'd love to see us doing more of that. And I think there's huge opportunities for that, as well as some of we were talking earlier before this webinar, that it'd be good to see some people from the US and the US companies here in Australia jumping out and setting up companies here. So really contributing and being part of that that ecosystem. And I think that's something that is certainly happening. And I'm sure Alex will talk a bit more about that. I know that you guys do a lot in terms of the ecosystem, but I think that the American companies here in Australia are a big part of that ecosystem we're trying to build the success of innovation in Australia.
Yeah, from our perspective, I think it lends itself towards the economic diversity and industry makeup in the US. And so we have a lot of higher value add industries appearing over there. And that's as a result of decades and decades of investment through in science technology through DARPA in the semiconductor industry that slowly led to the evolution of these internet-based firms. We do have, you're sitting on top of a pyramid of lots of research and spending and innovative culture over time, including a large venture capital industry. So when you have a company like Google coming out to Australia, and we have now more than 700 people working in our computer science department here directly on R&D, and the Australian economy earns about more than $330 million a year due to Google's R&D here directly. That means that those jobs, because of the value that they're contributing to the companies, because of the demand in which those employees are held, you see them in attracting higher wages. It means we need to contribute as a company in Australia that set up this engineering operation to university programs, to the talent pipeline right from the school level through high school and university, to make sure that we're getting high quality researchers. And so that's one aspect, a self-interested aspect of how we contribute to the evolution of the local technology industry. But it also comes from people who've worked at Google going out and working in other companies. For example, Canva, the chief technology officer of Canva, was a former Google engineer who decided to go out and work in another local firm. And it's those sorts of relationships where people develop those really high-level global skills they can't get outside of a large company that's been operating these hyperscale computing areas, and then go and take those skills to a local company that can really help to develop local industry. And I'm really positive about the international trade and I think investment relationship developing in areas like defense and space technology. That's been given a very clear runway by the government. But at the same time, as a company, you'll look at the media. We remain concerned about particularly in the information technology space at the moment, that it's a very hostile environment here. Australia's doing great things in digital trade, I think opening up great opportunities for services exports through the region, but unless we get the domestic policy settings right, we're going to continue to see what we're seeing at the moment, which is a continuing, not only a slowing growth in fixed capital formation in ICT in Australia, but a continual slowing of that growth. And we're already behind the OECD by about 30-something% in terms of value captured from digitization. We are 50% behind the P nation average when it comes to investment in automation in terms of our public sector companies. And so the fact that these US industries, Google and many other companies across a number of industries are coming in and making those R&D investments, making those higher value add investments in Australia that then transfer across the wider economy is hugely important.
Alex, before I move on to the sort of broader macro aspects and policy aspects of this issue, let me just get to a question about the firm level. And of course, you're from Google. In 2019, BCG names Google as the most innovative company in the world, replacing Apple. In terms of the work culture within Google, is there a particular emphasis on creativity and innovation, or is that just a byproduct of the things that you actually do? I ask because, in government departments, also in companies, you hear the word innovation 100 times in strategic documents. Is that something that Google does, or is it just something that results given the processes that you have?
So it's both. It's structural. Gmail, for example, is what we call a 20% project, where employees can spend 20% of their time on a project that they care about that may not be related to their everyday role, but which they are passionate about and think will make change. So now Gmail, which has more than 2 billion users now, I believe, was someone's side hustle, essentially, from their main job at Google. And that sort of idea that we have a bunch of talented people who have great ideas, and ideas come from the bottom of the company, not necessarily the top, is something that's fed into the culture of Google. It just means the more smart people you have thinking about creatively about how they might approach different problems, the more likely you are to find a solution to those problems. And that's philosophical, but I think it is the nature of the industry that we're in terms of digital technology, and the fact that we're, as a global economy, transitioning through this period of digitization akin to the industrialization process. That has advantages in terms of scale and reach. It has advantages in terms of not having to you can rely on other people's capital investments in terms of their data center technology. And obviously, as a large company, we've made large investments there. But if you're coming up into the digital technology space, you can acquire those resources relatively cheaply, scale relatively cheaply, reach cross borders relatively cheaply. And it means that small groups of people can have a disproportionate impact. And that's, I think, something that has helped us as a company and helps the startup community in Australia. And I think countries that are focusing on this, making sure that they get their digitization transformation right in general.
Thank you. Jim, let me come to you. You were the leading American diplomat in Australia for quite a long time. I think people may not realize that Australia didn't have an American ambassador for about 2.5 years, from September 2016 until March 2019. So you were effectively the lead diplomat in Australia. Now you are no longer a diplomat, so you can speak freely. In your time here, and you would have observed a lot of and taken part in a lot of the conversations, particularly corporate conversations. What were your impressions of the public and policy conversations and debates about innovation and our future? Was it thriving? Was it lacking? Was it complacent? Was the innovation piece largely missing? What was your broad impression given your time here?
Thanks, John. It was really interesting on a couple of fronts. First of all, American companies seem much more enthusiastic about the capabilities of Australia and Australians than Australian companies were. So you see, as Sarah mentioned, Lockheed Martin put its second skunk works. From all the world, they looked around and decided on Melbourne. Number 2, I think, was Sydney for their choice. Boeing, as was mentioned, has a big R&D operation. Oracle has a big R&D operation. Microsoft is doing quantum computing with, I think, the University of New South Wales or Sydney. So that's a lot of investment. Where are the Australian companies doing similar type things? Is that a cultural issue? Is it a budget issue? Why aren't Australian companies investing in Australian tech and R&D and how to use it? At least I didn't see it. That's first. Second, there seems to be a cultural issue. In the US, there's sort of an iron triangle between academia, government, and industry, where people go from one to the other, cross-fertilize, and create new companies, new ideas, which are then funded by venture capital and angel investors. Somehow that iron triangle is missing a link in Australia. Whether that's a cultural issue where academics don't tend to jump to industry, or if you work for a big Australian company, you don't tend to jump to private sectors often, I don't know, but that was missing. But the third one, and I think maybe perhaps this is most important, you may remember when Malcolm Turnbull was Prime Minister, he talked a lot about innovation in the future economy, and he was broadly mocked, derided for forgetting about real Australians and what the future of Australia really was. So if that's sort of the cultural view that innovation is distrusted or not real somehow, it's going to be harder for the country to get ahead and spend more in this area.
Actually, I have to say I was in the Turnbull government, and as you mentioned, innovation for the first year was the key word, and suddenly dropped off all of the talking points. And I agree with you, Jim, it was because it was seen as something that multimillionaires talk about. It wasn't seen as something relevant to the average Australian. But let me use that and pose either to Alex, Jared, or Sarah. I just wanted to focus a bit more on a cultural issue, because the caricature of Australian culture compared to the caricature of American culture is that in America, it's a badge of honor to try and fail and try again. In Australia, it is seen as a badge of shame to have failed even once, and you're better off getting or doing something where moderate success is guaranteed. Now, how much stock do you put in the cultural obstacles that we Australians place on ourselves when it comes to this issue? Happy for anyone to go for that.
I feel like Sarah may have the best insight on this as someone who has worked across and in both countries.
Yeah, so the cultural piece is complex. I was on a talk yesterday, they were saying culture isn't just culture. There's just so many bits to culture. So I think the try and fail piece is absolutely a challenge that we have. But then the part of that is a policy piece. And I know that during COVID, we pushed to change the bankruptcy laws because we thought, gosh, companies may well go bankrupt in a heartbeat during something like COVID. And so there were some changes to the bankruptcy laws, but there are some policy pieces that need to change. The try and fail piece, I think it actually might be more of a, we've got everything so good, and so you just want a secure income. Because we've got great beaches, we've got plenty of food, we've got peace and security. So I think it's more a case of why would you try and fail, because we've got everything so good. But COVID has put a massive spanner in that, and no one would wish COVID on anyone. But I think it is something that has shaken people into actually, what, we need to do things differently. So that cultural piece is, I'm really hopeful that we can maybe change some of that. There's a massive hurdle to change. And innovation by nature, needs change. It's been interesting watching from a government perspective how government employees didn't really want to go to use laptops and digital and working from home and all that. And before you know it, everyone's having to work from home, and now no work from home, and no one wants to come back and work in the office. I've heard of universities saying that they thought it was going to take them 5 years to go fully digital, and they did it in 2 weeks. So I think there's another cultural piece which is around change. You just don't want to go for change, but we've all been forced to. So I think that's really putting us in a spot where people are ready to do that change. But I would say that we do have a culture of entrepreneurship and innovation. We were born because of people coming across the other side of the world, having a blank canvas, and suddenly had to make a world out of something that was so alien to them. And we've been innovating ever since. I think we do have that in us. You think about the people who tinker in their garages to make things and do things differently from a sports perspective, all the sports innovation that goes on. I think, and obviously there's others, but I think we are innovative. We just don't talk about it very much. I mean, you go to the US, I never forget having a newspaper, I forget which one it was, in San Francisco outside my hotel room. I picked it up and went, oh my God, there's 2 startups on the front page. Then the next day I picked up the paper and, oh my God, there's 2 startups on the front page. I think that we don't talk about it enough and celebrate it enough in Australia. I think we've got some really fantastic startups and high-tech companies that we just don't talk about enough. And that brings you to the piece where you talked about Malcolm Turnbull. I think the sad thing, we were all so excited when Malcolm did all his big Innovation Science Australia or gender policy. We're so excited, and a lot of us were heavily involved in it. But I think he didn't bring the people along. The ideas boom, great, for nerds like us, woohoo, the ideas boom, but it just doesn't do it for the people who we need to bring along. And that's something that we haven't cracked. Like in Israel, you go to Israel and the mums persuade the kids, don't be a doctor, don't be a lawyer, go and be an entrepreneur. Very similar culture. In fact, once upon a time I had a green card and lived in the US, and it was the entrepreneurial culture I loved there. How do we get our mums and dads to get kids to see that this is the future? 75% of future high growth jobs need STEM, 65% of them don't exist. Our young people have got to get into STEM and build these new businesses. It's actually really, really key. And our relationship with the US and learning from the US how they've done that will be really important. But we do have to bring them along. We've got to think differently about how we explain it.
There's actually a really interesting piece about which I think has been driven by cultural complacency, and we've enjoyed a great deal of success economically because of the mining industry. And the resources will always be there. People have to come here to get them out of the ground. And there's been a similar complacency in terms of research and technology around Australia as a nation of early adopters. Now, we know when we look at the detail that Australians are able to early adopt technology because it's easy to scale to Australia out of global English-speaking supply chains. That is an intrinsic quality. That's something that occurs as a result of decisions made to bring products to Australia. Yet it was sort of the part of the Gestalt understanding. People just assumed that innovation would happen here because we were good at technology, because our consumers adopted technology early, which is about as useful as me saying, I use a spoon, I know how to use a spoon, I buy spoons, so I'm a metallurgist. And that sort of idea that we don't need to do effort because we have things here that people want, and the investment will naturally flow, is something that I think has really driven this complacency in policymaking about driving investment, helping Australia digitize and transform, and making sure we're actually on the front foot, succeeding and making the change ourselves rather than just waiting for it to happen to us. So instead of having a culture where you're looking for growth, you're looking for opportunity and looking outwards and to the future, you have a situation where governments are often focused on just twisting the screws on resource extraction, which has the perverse effect, the opposite effect, in fact, of making people reconsider the risk of investing here and making sure that looking to the opportunities elsewhere, nations where there is a real focus on that economic transformation. Indonesia is a great example. India is moving into that ballpark as well. And these are nations that, you look at Australia as an Asian nation, as part of the Asia Pacific, and those are the nations that we're in competition with. And we have to look at this in a relative sense of, are we succeeding?
Yeah, that's really interesting, Alex. When I went over to India, and I was struck by the number of multinationals that exist there, similar to Israel, but they're there for a different reason. But of course, now that reason is changing, and it's very much about collaborative R&D, about entrepreneurship, building new businesses. And one of my fears about COVID is that Australia will become very much more self-contained. I mean, there's an advantage in that we might get down to doing a bit more manufacturing, which would be good, and increasing our supply chains. But if we stop seeing the global markets, that's a massive issue. And I think that's one reason why we haven't done so well, is because we thought that the market is Australia. Like, you go to Israel, there is no market in Israel. So it's naturally global. And that's where the collaboration with the American multinationals will really help, because you've got global routes to market. So how do we build much more of that connectivity so that Australia sees those opportunities to get global, and work together to get our products and services global?
Thank you. Before we get to the Australian policy discussion, Jim, I just want to go back to you one more time. And it's really about the intersection of geoeconomics and geopolitics, which I know is something you spent your whole career in. And this draws from questions posed by Glenn Downey and a few others listening now. Now, Google's Eric Schmidt talks about the rise of two internets, one largely based in America or run by America, and one by China. More broadly, people are increasingly talking about a bifurcated technological or innovative ecosystem, a kind of technological or innovative firewall between two camps. Is that what the world of geoeconomics is starting to look like? And if that's the case, I would assume, therefore, that there would be quite a important role for the United States and allies to establish these sorts of joint capabilities. Is that the way you're seeing things going when it comes to the technological innovation space?
Well, John, the one thing in Washington both sides agree on right now is China's a problem. And however you slice it, 5G is a game changer in that it controls basically the entire economy, or has the potential to do so. And to the credit of the Australian government, they pointed this out pretty early and took action pretty early to protect this critical infrastructure. So if you're going to have an infrastructure that's closed to certain parties, and that, basically if you like, the electricity system of the new generation, that will necessarily mean two systems. One controlled by, presumably, the People's Republic of China, and one controlled by the West. And without the trust necessary to trust your critical infrastructure to the other side, I don't know how you can avoid this outcome. So that's one. Two, Australia, as a member of the Five Eyes, as a trusted party, could play a huge role in developing this infrastructure, not just for the United States and Australia, but for the Western world. And I think it's a pretty safe bet that at the recent Osman, this was discussed.
Okay, let's get to some Australian policy discussion, and it's raised by Chris Legg and quite a few other participants today. Jared, can I quickly get you to explain why you emphasize anchor firms to the extent that you do in your report? What are anchor firms and what role do they play? And then maybe I'll move to Sarah or Alex. Is the formation of anchor firms key to improving some of the indices that Jared has raised in his report? Jared.
Yeah, thanks, John. I think in Australia, just like much of the rest of the world, there is a bit of an over-emphasis on SMEs, or small and medium enterprises. We sort of have this notion around the world that innovations happen in someone's garage. Innovations are just small little things that someone as a side project decided to develop, something like Google, which Google was basically a project done in a garage. But what's important to note is that it didn't start there. Two key things that I think are important for people to understand in terms of innovation and commercializing research. Australia's world-renowned research, but it's well known for not commercializing it very well. But the two key things that I think are important are anchor firms, as you said, and venture capital firms. What are anchor firms? Anchor firms are basically large, established firms with lots of connections. So like Google, for instance. As Alex mentioned, with the former Google employee going to Canva, that employee, that Australian employee, was at Google, learned about the practices of a leading and innovative firm, and then brought it to an Australian firm. And that's a skills transfer, that's knowledge transfer. And that's why I think it's so important for Australia to not overemphasize SMEs, those small firms, because they are important, but you need the anchor firms if you want to be industry leading. And in terms of incentives, in terms of policies attracting innovation in Australia, there's probably been too much of an emphasis, in my opinion, on SMEs, and there needs to be more. And obviously, the elephant in the room in this is that it's not politically popular, right? It's easy to say, oh, these big tech firms, they don't need anything, they'll be fine on their own. It's like, no, they're firms, and they need incentives sometimes, just like everyone else. And I think the more Australia really tries to attract larger firms at the same time that it attracts SMEs, the better for the innovation ecosystem here in Australia.
Sarah, Alex, anchor firms. Is perhaps Sarah, in the Queensland government now, is this a conversation that's occurring?
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely it is in many ways and forms. I'd like to say that, you know, what are their use? How are they? That's not the right word, but how can they add value? And how are they currently adding value? Alex talked about the R&D that they're doing here in Australia. That's a massive piece. Commercialization of R&D in Australia has been a challenge and still is a challenge. And so the anchor firms are really key in terms of drawing that R&D out and taking it into their products and services and off to market. That's really key. The other one is taking SME ideas. So you don't need to throw the baby out with the bathwater. The SMEs are important. What are they? Something like 97% of our companies are SMEs. So they are key. But how do you help them work with those anchor firms? Boeing is a classic example. We've got a project with them where they're working with the SMEs in their supply chain, which is now more of a value chain. So they're helping build their capability as well as working with them to take their ideas to market. And that's something that we need to consider. You know, how do we make sure that our SMEs are ready for the anchor firms? Because the anchor firms are already important, but they won't reach out to the SMEs unless they're good enough. Our research is fabulous. Our SMEs still need a little bit of help. And I've seen that both in the defense sector and the rail supply sector. I think the other one is around entrepreneurs. So Roy Green did a good piece of work, gosh, ages ago now, maybe 10 years ago, that talked about what was needed in our entrepreneur ecosystem. And actually it was skills like how to do your marketing, how to do your HR and your finance. So some classic business skills that you learn in an anchor firm. It just becomes your common breath of how you do these things. And so it's important for people to go through a multinational and then jump out and set up their own company so that we can build more companies and more high value add jobs within our ecosystem. The last thing I want to say is when Malcolm Turnbull was doing his piece 5 years ago, something I suggested was he should have a club. You know, he should have a really exclusive club where he spends personal time with CEOs of some of these anchor firms. Yeah, maybe that wouldn't do it, but you know, what is it that would really attract and help our anchor firms realize how important they are to our economy? That was just an idea I had about 5 years ago.
But sorry, to Sarah, Alex, or James, I mean, is there an example of a sector in Australia where anchor firms have played that role successfully that you describe?
Oh, look, I think the Boeing example that I gave, Alex can talk to his examples and the work that they're doing, but because I know they're doing a lot of great work in this. Google's doing some fabulous work building our ecosystems. But you know, Boeing is doing that in Queensland in a very important way. BHP, for instance, they're running a program where they're actually trying to transform education. So I'm on some committee where we're looking at how do we change TAFE universities, get some micro-credentials out around autonomous vehicles. So I think there are companies that are starting to do that, and some that have been doing it for quite some time.
I just want to quickly add, if I can, Boeing's largest investment footprint outside of America is Australia. And why is that? It's because they trust Australia. Australia has great aviation capacity in both skills, but also in the environment. But also, Australia is part of the Five Eyes intelligence agreement. Australia has so many tailwinds going for it. And that leads to firms with really sensitive IP, really sensitive innovations to come to Australia. And what I want my report to hopefully do is say, these firms are already here, you need more of them. You need more investment from them, and you need more like them.
Just to add on to that, cloud computing is the future of computing. Secure cloud is a big subset of that. Australia, as one of the Five Eyes, clearly is in the position, if they can add value to security and operability and interoperability of cloud computing, huge opportunity.
I think it's clear from the makeup of the ASX that when you look at any industry that involves a lot of high technology, that it is foreign firms that are coming into the market that actually make up most of the industry. Information technology, for example. We now have some great Australian firms, be they the Atlassians and Canvas of the world, the Afterpays, Safety Culture. Many of these Australian firms are now coming up through the ecosystem, but starting that ecosystem with the big American firms in the same way that there is in defense, some advanced manufacturing, previously in automotive manufacturing. But one thing that we've missed talking about, and one thing I think is hugely important for Australia's economic development, is the large local firms being in a position where they can invest in this technology. Most Australians, through their workplace experience, will work in one of these larger Australian firms for banking industry, financial, retail, and these are the firms where I'd love to see the government look at encouraging investment. And this will affect the broader ecosystem, but the vast majority of skills transfer is going to happen when these large Australian companies see the priority the government is putting on digital transformation and really start to invest in that area, because we have fallen well behind the rest of the developed world when it comes to investment in digital technology, which is a stage of economic transformation and is really a huge risk for the Australian economy. And what we're hearing from the boards of these large Australian companies is that, why would we invest now? We have no idea if 6 months down the track there's going to be some change that makes all this investment valid. So we really need to see some focus and priority from the government in making sure that we are, A, recognise the problem that Australia has fallen well behind the developed world when it comes to investment in technology, and B, focus on how we can actually improve that. What is the story there?
Alex, let me go on from that. It draws from a question from Don Scott Kemmis. Google already has a sizable footprint in Australia, but what would you like to see that would encourage Google and other companies like you to invest a lot more in R&D? What are the couple? Is it tax policy, regulatory policy? Is it something different to that? What is it that you'd like to see?
I think fundamentally a return to good governance when it comes to policy making and technology. We've seen a lot over the past few years of policy made and legislated inside of a week with no response from industry. We're seeing situations where, for example, in the latest published code being put forward by the ACCC, where arbitrators are required to consider all the value brought by the people on the other side of the equation and completely ignore any value that's provided by platforms to Australia, or the publishers, for example. And so in a lot of these cases, you look at the policies and the processes that go into making them, and clearly they're leading to problematic outcomes from even basic standards of basic fairness. But you look at this situation and say, we see all of this negative stuff happening. It's often happening in a way that is suboptimal and ends up in poor outcomes that'll disincentivize investment. How do we actually make sure that the Australian government gets back to a sound policy-making process? We have no problem with paying our fair share of tax here. We're a top 100 taxpayer in Australia. We would love to be able to invest more here, but even if you dig into the little details around policy areas, you find areas of risk that might be unexpected. For example, you can't do open source AI research and development in Australia because there's no fair use provision in copyright law. You would do that overseas in nations like Japan that has a data use exemption, Singapore, Israel or the US, which have fair use exemptions. And you find these little nuggets around a variety of policy areas where Australia just hasn't modernized its its legislative framework. And when you combine that with a very ad hoc and poorly thought through, and certainly ending up in suboptimal outcomes in regulatory processes, you start to wonder, how do we think about our business and our investments for the future here when they might be turned on their head in 6 months, and we may get no real opportunity to actually comment on that, or our thoughts and concerns may not even be listened to. So I think that's where we are at in terms of our view of the country at the moment. Where we would see an advantage is just to a return to sound policymaking that has a future focus and a real expert view in terms of how the economy and the market is functioning. And I think that's what a lot of this comes down to, that Australia hasn't got a high level of technological expertise in terms of the decision and policymaker level, and we really need to make sure that we lean in as a company, and the research community leans in, the local companies lean in to actually bridging that gap between the understanding of how this digitization process and the economy works and the decisions that are being made.
Let me bring conversation back to you, Sarah, and also you, Jim, because you know Australia pretty well now. Sarah, you said something earlier, which I think is entirely true, which was that people like you were very excited by Malcolm Turnbull's use of the word innovation and agility and so on, and opportunities, but he didn't bring people with him. So the question I would pose to you, Sarah, and perhaps Jim as well, if you want to chip in, is how, I know it's not just a matter of presentation, but how do you present, how do you return that focus to the importance of innovation in a political and public conversation that brings people along with you, and such that it's not seen as some sort of elite thing that people with PhDs actually talk about?
Just jump in here and say, if Jim can answer first, because he has a hard stop at 11.
Thanks. It's really interesting because here in Singapore and elsewhere in Southeast Asia, governments are using COVID, sort of as Sarah indicated, as, all right, we have a paradigm shift coming. We need to be ready for a new real where trade in goods is maybe more difficult. We need to invest in the next technologies. So we're working with a lot of clients in Singapore, Indonesia, on how to access government programs that help individuals skill up, find jobs in new growth sectors, help these companies go abroad to find suppliers and technology. It's really a lot of ferment and almost excitement, as the Singapore Minister of Trade just said the other day, look, those jobs are gone and probably aren't coming back. We as Singapore Inc. have to figure out what comes next. Let's work together. I'm not hearing that in Australia. I fear that it's still the attitude that Malcolm faced of, there's no lead issue.
And Sarah, when I go to you, perhaps if you have a view additionally as to whether a recession might change mindsets. I hate to put it like that, but 28 years of economic growth does do something to one's psychology.
Yeah, so I think the mantra that I'm pushing at the moment is jobs for today, jobs for tomorrow, because it is about jobs. You talk about a recession. What's a recession? It means people are out of work. So I think we need to think about innovation in the terms of jobs. And part of that is actually getting into people's shoes. It's so easy for me as a, highly educated, globally experienced, techie nerd to go, wow, this is so exciting. I can't wait to see IoT take over the world. But it's frightening for people. So I think getting into people's shoes, understanding where they're coming from, speaking about jobs and what that means for them. Obviously, it's a whole pipeline. So encouraging kids to see the future for them. And the future for them is, basically, if you don't get into this, we won't have any jobs. But also the parents, and making sure that's a key piece, is making sure the parents understand that, your kids can't go and be a lawyer and they'll have a job for life. It's just not going to be like that. But also, it's not frightening. This is all possible. We can do this. We are humans. Humans do this. So we can do it. Removing that fear is really important. I think the other piece is just showing that some of the skills that we have today will be valuable for the future. they're just packaged a bit differently. I think we all think we're going to lose our jobs completely and we'll all be totally useless for the future, but we're not. We actually have some skills now that we can transfer. So, and that's all part of that removing the fear piece. So it's firstly, remove the fear. Secondly, get them excited about, you can build these jobs. You're a human, humans do this. We can build these jobs and we can build them together.
Well, we have run out of time, unfortunately. Look, I want to thank my panelists for making it such a stimulating conversation. I wish you could have gone for longer. I really want to thank Jared for his report, which I've read and which will come out next Thursday. I want to thank my colleagues at the United States Studies Centre who make these webinars work. Janine, Mari, Taylor and Zoe in particular. A reminder that the next United States Studies Centre webinar is on Tuesday next week, the 18th of August. It is part of our Election Watch 2020 series on the perils of pre-election polling, extremely topical right now. And a recording of today's session will be available on the USSC website shortly. So thank you very much to my panelists and thank you to those who have logged on.